Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its continuing mission:
to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations,
to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Welcome to Live Long and Podcast, the greatest Star Trek podcast in the world.
Universe.
And this is episode 1. My name is Dave Mater, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jaemeel Robinson.
Hello.
And also joining us from the United States, Jim Edelston.
Hello all.
So this has been a project that's been in the works for quite some time now, and I'm glad it's finally come to fruition. This is actually our second attempt at our pilot episode. The original recording took place between me and my girlfriend Ashley. The issue being she doesn't know anything about Star Trek. So it was a little bit harder to have a conversation where I kind of just told her everything about Star Trek, where I think we have to assume that most people that will be listeners of this program will already be Star Trek fans, at least in a casual sense. And to speak about who we are, this is based out of Canada. Me and Jaemeel, we're close proximity to Toronto, Ontario. How did this come about? I'm a lifelong enthusiast of Star Trek, and we're going to kind of get about how that came about. But essentially, I was kind of inspired by Kevin Smith, in a sense. Even though he's not necessarily a Star Trek enthusiast, he does a show of his own called Batman on Batman, where he talks about his idol, Batman, where he does worships Batman Weekly, has guests on, talks about all facets of the character. And when I heard that program, I was like, I'm passionate about Trek, and I think that this is something that I like to do. And that's what kind of inspired me to get this going. After a long time of trying to find a co-host, Jaemeel, I realized, who I've known for about 2-3 years now, is also a big Star Trek fan. Jaemeel, I think you were tweeting one day, what am I thinking of? The Best of Both Worlds, when it was playing on the big screen back in April. Yes.
Yes.
And I was like, oh man, I would love to go see Best of Both Worlds, Star Trek The Next Generation on the big screen. And then our schedule never really worked out, so we never actually got to go do that. But that was sort of like the first time I'm like, I think Jaemeel likes Star Trek a lot. And I knew you're into a whole lot of sci-fi and stuff, but I think you're as dedicated to Trek as I am, perhaps. And also, we have different perspectives on the genre, because we were kind of talking a few months ago about Trek, and just some differences on which shows may be the best, which ones are the weaker ones.
Yeah, so I'll just start off with where I started with Trek. It actually started when I was in elementary school. I moved from Toronto proper, and I moved to the suburbs, Mississauga. I was in my early grade school phase of grade 3 or 4 at that time, and making new friends. And at that time, there was 2 things that majority of my friends were really passionate about. That was wrestling and Star Trek.
Yeah.
Which looking back, not really the coolest things you would think of at that time.
All the stuff the girls like, right?
Yes. It stayed with me. I got into it then. Plus, in addition, coming home and watching at that time Next Generation. My dad was a big fan of the original series, so I would watch that with him. So I was watching both at the same time, one the original series looking back at it and the Next Generation looking forward. So then and there, and I guess at that time it was the early '90s. Star Trek: The Next Generation had like a groundswell of support from the fans because it came back. It got a whole bunch of new fans, including myself, who at a very impressionable age got hooked.
Absolutely, yeah. We're about the same age, I think, right, Jaemeel? Like I know. Well, I know Fenos is about 3 months older than me. Our mutual friend, Chris Fenos.
You mean Fenos?
Good
Yeah,
job
Fenos.
saying his name correctly.
Yeah, I learned.
I'm a July baby, 1982, so I'm 31.
Okay, you're about a little like 9 months older than me. Okay, so around the time that Next Generation hit, we're about 4 or 5 years old, and Edelston, you're just a tad older than Jaemeel and I.
Right.
So, and I know, and Edelston, you're going to kind of bring in your take on this because you're not necessarily a Trekker by heart, even though you are a huge sci-fi fan, and you do respect. You said in particular the Next Generation was sort of the show that you gravitated towards the most of all the Treks.
Right. Next Generation was my favorite.
So when Next Generation hits in '87, what was your take on it? Because we're sort of like the Next Generation. We're the TNG generation. That was sort of like our first show. The original series sort of predates us, at least our births.
Yeah, I never actually got into it when it first started airing. One of my buddies, Brian, him and his brother were into it big time, and they used to record every show on VHS, which back at that shows you how long ago that was. They introduced me to it because my first impressions of Star Trek was the original series, which was okay, but never really, excited me or did much for me. But we started watching Star Trek Next Generation, and they had every episode back from the first one. Watched them on VHS from beginning till whatever season it was what they caught me up on. The series itself was phenomenal. Riker, by hands down, my favorite character in the series. Even Picard, even though he's phenomenal, Riker's the man. I have to give him credit, but
Because he's got that Han Solo effect to him, Riker. He's
Riker, Riker's kind of a mix of I would say Picard and Kirk.
Yeah,
At least,
I could see that.
Yeah, in my opinion. But definitely kind of the Han Solo swagger. Plus all the ladies digged him. And it just drew me in from there, and watched several of the series afterwards. But even Next Generation, when it's on TV, I'll still flip the channel to it and sit there and watch it. It show's great. Greatest characters ever. I think we talked about this when we were all in Cleveland for hockey a week or so ago. Was Q.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Q character definitely one of the more entertaining on Next Generation for sure, and sort of like a strange bad guy to have because he's the all-powerful character, and I think we could probably have a whole episode just on Q. He's more powerful than anything combined, anything that mere mortals can come up with, and yet he's an intellectual foe for the most part because of that fact, because he's so much more infinitely more powerful than the characters that it's Picard and the crew that kind of have to outsmart him most of the time.
He's their Mitzlit Pidalik for the most part.
Well, if you go back to the original series, there was a character called Trelane, who was the Squire of Gothos, who was a very similar sort of character that had sort of an omnipotent being with sort of a curious fascination, almost like a kid with a magnifying glass, playing with some ants. That's kind of the way the Q and Trelane characters sort of related to humanity because they were so much more advanced.
Would you actually really classify him as a bad guy, though?
It depends on Q. Like in some episodes, Q is certainly a villain, and definitely the Trelane character from the original series would be
definitely a villain.
Definitely a villain. Q, sort of not a. In some cases, yes. Like in the original series pilot, which is Encounter at Farpoint, he's certainly the villain of that story. He's and there's a few other cases throughout the series, and then when it comes back to the finale, All Good Things, he's not so much a villain in that. He's more as he's trying to demonstrate a lesson.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think most of his stuff was lesson driven. His character also evolved from what he originally appeared as till what he became also.
Yeah, and there was like, I don't know how many appearances he made through the course of the 7 seasons on Next Generation. It's got to be around 10, I'd say.
Yeah.
But some of them were more like him coming in. Like there was the one where he made Riker
omnipotent.
Omnipotent. He tried to get him to join the Q continuum. In that, he's certainly a villain. I'd say for the first 2 seasons, probably he definitely is. And then there is this transition where he becomes more of a lighthearted character, where he's just more of a gamester. There was the one where he threw them all into the Robin Hood story.
Yeah, that was a good one.
There were many good ones. So Q was sort of the character for you, Jim, that brought you into it, or sort of the most entertaining for you. For me, my dad was a huge original series guy, and I remember when Next Generation came out, when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I was watching it, and I knew what the original series was, but I had no context around these characters. I was like, they're the Next Generation, so I was literally taking it out like, well, the captain should be the son of Captain Kirk, and Spock's kid should be the first officer. And it took me a long time to like kind of wrap that around my mind, that these were a whole new set of people in a whole different time. So around early 90s, I'd say, like around the 3rd, 4th season, me and my friends just start getting into it. Trek just becomes the thing to do. I had a couple friends in particular who really inspired me to do it and get into the show. And from there, it was just watching it in syndication constantly. As that show ended around the time I'm about 11, Deep Space Nine had kind of kicked in, and then Voyager shortly after that, and then Enterprise. So basically, Star Trek was a major part of what I watched and what I kind of was into for 16 years of my life.
Deep Space Nine was very entertaining. I like that too. The Ferengi in there were sweet.
Yeah, well, the Deep Space Nine was personally my favorite series, mostly because it was a serialized version of Star Trek. Most of Star Trek was based on, like, the ship shows up, they find an alien or a new discovery or whatever, they beam down, and it all kind of wraps up in that hour.
For the most part, Star Trek was a procedural.
Yeah, it was a procedural wagon train to the stars kind of show.
Yeah.
They would have some things on like Next Generation that would link together. They have some 2-parters or some characters that would be reoccurring. The original series by far was the most procedural, most episodic in nature, where I think they only had a few characters come back here or there. And essentially, if you watch that show, it's really hard to tell the difference between the first, second, and third season of the original series.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, I would say seasons 3 through 7 on the Next Generation, very much the same. The first 2 seasons kind of stand out as a little bit different for me. They kind of changed the format after that.
Yeah.
How many seasons were there on the original? There was only like 3 or 4, wasn't there?
There was 3. There was 3.
Sorry, yeah.
There's 3, and then they did the animated series after that, which was the cartoon version, which was voiced by all the same guys. That went on for about a year or 2. So that kind of like wrapped up that whole 5-year mission. And then of course, we know Star Trek became very, very popular in syndication in the 70s. And then Star Wars came out. And Star Wars gave birth to a reinvigoration around sci-fi and doing something big around that. And Paramount said, we got to do the same thing that Star Wars and 20th Century Fox just did. So Star Trek got brought back to the big screen. It had been in development as a sequel series. They were going to do Star Trek Phase 2 at one point. And it was going to be very similar to what eventually became The Next Generation. And if you watch that movie, like the first officer, Will Decker, is very much like a Will Riker. The alien in that, the bald alien chick, I forget her name, Elania or something. But she was kind of like the Troy. So that they did that first motion picture, which is by far the worst Star Trek movie ever made.
I tend to disagree.
You disagree?
I disagree.
Okay, well, that's what the debate's for.
Final Frontier is by far the worst.
Worse than motion picture? Star Trek 1?
Like, motion picture is annoying because of the amount of establishing shots that are shown throughout the picture. It's like they get this amazing budget, and they finally are on the big screen, and they just want to showcase everything. All right, so So you're
It was very much
spending.
an effects.
Sorry.
It was kind of effects driven, right?
Yeah.
They wanted to show the big practical models that ILM had made and things like that.
So you're watching the movie and you're just watching slow motion, like you hear the music swelling and you're just seeing side shots of the Enterprise and then another angle and another angle, and by like the third time you get through it, you just get kind of sick of it, which is why I kind of found Star Trek I guess 11, Star Trek 2009, the reboot, when they finally do show the Enterprise, you get that establishing shot, and for the most part they never really linger on the ship again.
Quite like that.
Yeah.
Ever again, yeah. Yeah, well, like, if you watch the motion picture, have you seen it, Jim?
The new ones?
No, the original one.
Yes.
Where it's like 20 minutes. I don't know, it's not really that long, but it's got to be a good 10 minutes of Kirk taking the shuttle up to the ship, and he's looking at the Enterprise like, and it's just panning.
Right.
It's showing this, it was like, look, the ship looks real now. It doesn't look quite like it did in the 60s. And it just goes on. But that's just one scene. Like, the villain in that movie is a big robot satellite thing that comes back. And, the V'ger story.
I have to confess, I was... Wrath of Khan's got to be my least favorite.
Wow.
Blasphemy. Blasphemy.
I got to tell you the story why, though. So, Wrath of Khan comes out, 82? So, at that time, I'm 8 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, my mother takes me to the movies, and I fell asleep in it. And I was woken up as the credits were running, end credits. Woke up, taken out of the theater. So, that's why I claim that's my least favorite. Haven't gone
it since?
Yes, going back and watching it, it was great.
Yeah, well, Wrath of, maybe it goes over an 8-year-old's head. Like, the big theme about Wrath of Khan is aging and sort of, is it the time to settle down? Like, Kirk's kind of struggling with that the whole time because he's not in command of a ship anymore. Now he's an admiral. He's working at the academy. Bones' famous line where he says, damn it, Jim, other people have birthdays. Why are we treating yours like a funeral? Within the Star Trek movies. Because you basically can consider 2, 3, and 4 sort of their own little trilogy.
Yeah.
Which is one of my favorites. And with that cast in particular, they really kind of came into their own. One of the reasons I hate the first one, the motion picture, was because I felt like the acting was extremely stiff in the movie. I thought that the characters were sort of boring. I thought Kirk came across like a tremendous asshole.
For the most part, Kirk is an asshole, though.
For the most part, he is an asshole, but he was never quite like that in the show or after that.
He's the charismatic hero asshole, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in the motion picture, he just kind of comes across like a pretentious asshole. Like not in the good way, not in the compelling, charismatic way.
Well, that's exactly the same type of character he played in Generations. This, I know better than you. You have to convince me to help you. I've done my due diligence.
I've done my part for King and Country.
Yeah, that's the exact line that he uses.
Personally, I don't understand why Kirk or Shatner was even in
Generations.
Yes,
they wanted it as like a kind of a crossover, like passing of the torch type of thing for the Next Generation crew. It wasn't really necessary, but
that movie could have been a lot better without him.
I'm of the opinion that All Good Things should have been the movie, and Generations should have been the series finale of Next Generation.
The Generations with Kirk and stuff?
Yeah, because All Good Things seemed like a more epic movie, epic story, as opposed to Generations, which just seems like, really, we just want to see Kirk and Picard on the same screen, destroy the Enterprise. That was basically the gist of the story.
And that's what it felt like, too.
Yeah, the villain, I thought, like, Malcolm McDowell in that movie is a good villain. I thought, like, you really want to hate that guy in the movie. I don't hate Generations. I thought that killing Kirk and destroying the Enterprise. I don't like when they put things in movies just for shock value, because, like, in terms of who these characters are, and in a sense, the ship is in itself a character. it just kind of felt like a real slap in the face to a large degree with that movie. I think the story is good. I like the idea of, like, you know, putting how they were. It's one of those things with Star Trek where it often starts off with good intentions and then it all goes to shit.
Yeah.
And then it kind of gave birth to these next 3 movies, which were, you know, First Contact,
Insurrection, and Nemesis.
Nemesis, yeah. Which essentially felt like episodes on the big screen for the most part. I think First Contact being the best of all of them.
Yeah.
But the Enterprise...
First Contact seemed really epic. Right? It's the first time you've seen the Borg on the big screen, and it seems like they went all out in terms of their presentation and kind of evolving the character of the Borg as a whole. Mm-hmm. And then Insurrection just seemed like it wasn't able to be on par with what they previously faced. It's just, it's another, you know, we have to rescue this civilization, and, you know,
these bad aliens, and, you know, it's...
Riker gets a shave, and he's hanging out with Troy again. Just...
hanging Troy again, because he got his hormones turned back on.
First Contact did rock, though.
First Contact was a great film, and it was disappointing that they didn't follow it up with something better. And they never really did.
They tried with Nemesis, but it was just one gigantic chase scene. And
they sort of busted their nut on that movie, I felt, like on First Contact, which, you know, at the end of the day, we got a great movie out of it. And combining the story, taking that villain of the Borg, and also tying it in with how Star Trek came to be, like showing the first contact between humans and Vulcans, showing that
Cochrane, you know,
Cochrane and the, like, the Phoenix and the first warp flight, all that was really compelling, and also showing, like, the connection between today and what Star Trek is.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of like, you know, really why Star Trek. Why, you know, it's obviously got a great set of characters. It's obviously endured for 50 years for a reason. And a lot of that has to do, and many Star Trek fans will say the same thing, is that it's a promise of a better future, of a better tomorrow. Essentially, in the future in Star Trek, you know, Earth is at peace and is working in cooperation with other nation states, and it really, or other planetary governments rather, not nation states, bringing cooperation and peace and exploration. And yeah, sometimes you got to fight some bad aliens because, you know, it's not all friendly out there. But a lot of what I value in life, I kind of learned from Star Trek.
I don't mean to take away from that epic speech there, Dave, but the best thing that happened to me today was you saying busting their nut.
That's what you take from that whole speech right there.
I couldn't even concentrate after that. I had busting the nut queued up in my head, and I'm like, I gotta wait for Dave to pause.
We're talking about how Star Trek is so significant and so culturally relevant. Yes, and they did bust their nut in terms of the Next Generation film franchise anyway.
Yeah.
On that particular film.
It's unfortunate because I just felt that they could have really done something interesting with, like, having that budget, having the support, and I think people were just tremendously let down by Insurrection, that they never really came back to support Nemesis, regardless of how much supposed promise that it had in its trailers and the stories the first time the Romulans are ever portrayed on film. I think people were just kind of done. They could have really, you know, kickstarted. They should have honestly thought about a movie story arc. And especially at that time, you know, they should have tried to make it just start fresh. Star Trek First Contact is the first Star Trek Next Generation movie. Let's forget about Generations. Let's put together a trilogy of some sort, or a real franchise. It just seemed like they were doing another episode of Star Trek. They had an idea for an episode/movie, and they did it. They filmed it, and there wasn't that much passion in it.
Right.
The popularity behind TNG, they could have done exactly what you said, made some sort of franchise out of the movies, and you know, just look at what they're doing now with the reboot. The whole new audience and everything that they've done there versus what Lucas did with Star Wars back in the day. And they had the ability to make those movies a lot better than they did special effects wise and whatnot. And even there, some of the parts it just kind of seemed like it fell flat with those.
My comment, what I mean specifically making the franchise, as opposed to what they did, was when you watch Star Trek 2009 and then you watch Star Trek Into Darkness, it feels like a progression from the first movie, right? The characters are referencing situations from the previous movie. When you watch First Contact and then you watch Insurrection, it just seems like they're procedural episodes. First Contact is done, the status quo has been set, and then it's another story, and it doesn't really have any type of connection to what previously happened. Right? That is my issue. It should have been, I'm watching this new movie, the continuing voyages, the continuing situation with these characters. How are they progressing? There wasn't really any progression, really, between the two.
No, it was just like they were on a new ship now, and they're doing basically the same thing they always did. The thing with this, with Star Trek, is that at the end of the day, it's a crew of people, and the original series addressed this, where they're technically have careers and they're officers, and they want to eventually be Star Trek captains of their own. So with the original series crew, they got older. And they kind of settled into different roles and within Starfleet. With the Next Generation, it was like, well, these guys have been together for like 18 years, and they're still flying around the same ship with all the exact same ranks, and nothing's really changing. Nothing's really evolving with these characters. Not to mention that the Enterprise E it didn't feel like the same grandeur that the series had with the Enterprise D, the Galaxy class ship. It wasn't. At the end of the day, Star Trek's about exploration for the most part, and kind of thinking outside the box. Like, I think All Good Things is a good example of one of the greatest Star Trek episodes ever in that same way.
I agree.
And when you go to a movie, it's like, yeah, I know it has to sort of be entertaining and it sort of has to be high-paced in action, but you look at a movie like Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, where there is no bad guy in that movie. And in fact, there's very few tense situations. That's a pretty lighthearted Star Trek movie, but you really enjoy that they're kind of fighting against nature or against a set of circumstances they can't completely control, and they have to work together. And that was always kind of what was different about like a Star Trek versus a lot of other sci-fi like Star Wars, where Star Wars is I enjoy Star Wars. It's fun, and I like to see a lightsaber fight as much as anybody, but it's just a lot of like bang bang, shoot at each other, and then something blows up, and then credits. Not to take jabs at your Star Wars there, Jim. There's plenty of other sci-fi examples I could give you.
Yeah.
But that's why Star Trek always kind of stood out as special to me, is because it wasn't like the rest of it. It wasn't just going to be a formulaic action movie. And with the case of some of the movies, that's why they kind of fell flat. And then you look at the new movies, Star Trek and Star Trek Into Darkness. And what did you guys think about those two movies, respectively?
Absolutely phenomenal.
Okay, I thought that it was. It's nice to see an action-filled Star Trek, but it is not Star Trek in the traditional sense.
It's the Star Wars of Star Trek.
Yeah,
sort of. Yeah. It's there's a great divide among the fans, among the Star Trek enthusiasts of the world. But definitely it was after that 2009 movie, and now with this one, that some people are saying it's not Star Trek. It's a portrayal of what it should be. That it's the action version. That where's the heart? Where's the exploration? Where's the all those kinds of things that make Star Trek special, versus just running around. And I kind of understood it with the first one, but you're sort of reestablishing a new set of characters, a new mythos. None of these guys have been on a TV series before, so you have to sort of reinvent it with different versions of the same characters, the way they did it. When I watched Into Darkness, I was like, I understood what those two writers, I think it's Bob Urchi, I forget their names right now, but...
Is it Urchi and Kurtzman or something? Or?
Urchi and Kurtzman, yeah. That they wrote both of those films, and I think that, they're definitely huge Star Trek fans, and they're trying to find a way to make Star Trek as appealing to as many people as possible without alienating the core base.
They have a tough... Sorry, go ahead.
And a large contingent of the core base said, fuck you, we don't care about appealing to everybody. That's why Star Trek.
And I understand the situation that they're faced with, because they're not a slave to the fans. They're more a slave to the studio. The studio has this franchise, this name of Star Trek, that they want to get value for. And frankly, there isn't value in a Star Trek that is appealing to most traditional fans. There isn't any money in it, right? You could make a new Star Trek movie exactly like, First Contact or Insurrection or Nemesis, and
Sure.
You'll make about 100, 125 worldwide. That's not good enough. That's not good enough for them to invest the money in the special effects and the marketing for that type of franchise. They need a tentpole film, and making it appeal to a general populace is what's going to make Star Trek get made, for the most part. Now, my hope is at the end of the day, when the movies die down, Paramount's going to say, we're going to make a television show. It's going to be scaled back, and they'll know that they can focus on story-driven entertainment, and there'll be a set of people who grew up with those shows that will be hungry for it, because they'll be in their 20s and 30s and 40s.
Now, how did these two do in the box office compared to the other ones?
They killed it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, along with what you said, Jaemeel, though, my twist on it, since I was never hardcore into it, I love how they rebooted the series, because I don't like reboots of stuff mostly, but I liked what they did because the way the story was written, they paid respect to the old storyline, the old information that was there, and basically took it, crumbled it up, threw it in the garbage, and said, we're reintroducing everything. And in a way that they did it, everybody can bitch about everything, but they basically did it, took that, reinvented it, and there wasn't much anybody could say, because they made it evident they rewrote the storyline.
Yeah, well, they used time travel as a
Right.
mechanism.
I know, but
and to be honest, and just for clarification, they didn't throw away the old Star Trek, because essentially they created a new timeline. It's kind of like in Back to the Future when Marty McFly goes back to 1985 in part 2, but it's like Biff's rule in the world. You know that part?
right.
It's sort of like that. It's an alternate timeline. It's almost like a separate multiverse sort of a thing, where this new Star Trek with the Chris Pine and as Kirk and everything, it didn't erase the old Star Trek. That was sort of like how they kind of compromised, because if they just erased 40 years of the series, and you got to remember that the great thing with Star Trek is that all these characters weave together, and the shows sort of make reference to each other a lot. To kind of throw that all away and start from the beginning.
But they took characters like Kirk and Spock. I mean, when you'd say Kirk or Spock, everybody would immediately think of William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy.
Right.
Correct.
Okay? But the way they rebooted it, like you said, with the different timeline,
Yeah.
you can buy the fact that it's still Kirk. It's just a different Kirk along a different timeline.
You buy it, and like I like the art, like the choice to sort of take a new interpretation on those characters, and some of them were better than others.
Yeah.
And some of them aren't consistent with the other ones, like Chekhov, for instance. I think he's way younger than he's supposed to be, or
Tremendously younger.
Yeah, he's way younger than he's supposed to be, because the new movies take place like when he gets into the academy, when he finally gets up to the ship in the first one to fight the Nero, the Romulan. This is taking place in the 2250s, around 2258, whereas the original series takes place in the late 2260s. So all these guys, like Kirk's a captain way before he should be, or he would have been.
Yeah.
And the same with the rest of them. Really, they would have had much longer careers and been more distinguished servicemen. If you watch the original series, it's definitely got that naval military kind of feel to it, even though they didn't want to kind of present it as them being a military per se, more like a space agency. But
that goes back to Jameel's point. The reason they're all so young, and they explained it the way they did, is because they wanted young actors for that. You know, if it was successful, to be able to keep making them. You know,
right.
To lock these guys into the contracts to make X amount over so long, where they would age, but they could account for that.
Yeah, I think they. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just going back to my earlier point in terms of like the box office and the money, right? You have I'm looking at the list here of like the worldwide box office to the Star Trek films. The highest grossing worldwide box office film for the Star Trek, the original set of films, was the motion picture, which made $139 million. That's their worldwide box office. Right? First Contact surpassed that 150. 150 nowadays isn't doing anything. That would be a failure. A complete failure.
For inflation, right?
Well, 150 from, when was it? 1997 or 90. When was First Contact? Like 90.
98.
Yeah, 98. That's still 150 million. That isn't good enough in general. For worldwide box office? Not really. And then you're dealing with Star Trek and Into Darkness, which made 385 and 452, respectively, in terms of millions. Right?
Yeah. They spent a hell of a lot more on marketing for those movies, too. Than they did.
True.
But yeah, I understood why. Like, it's more of a fast pace. You gotta make it appealing to the new generation, and even if you go back and watch like the '60s version of Star Trek, to try to get somebody today, like in their early 20s, to watch that, I don't think they would in most cases. Like, there'd be some exceptions to the rule, but you need to make Star Trek
sexy.
But sexy. You have to make it sexy. You gotta make it funny, but you don't want to give up what makes it
Star Trek in the first place.
For the most part, they kind of walked the line pretty well, and I think that the movies overall were good, and I think for the most part they're good for keeping Star Trek alive and going. Because after Nemesis, was Nemesis after Enterprise got canceled? I'm trying to remember. No, it was before that, right?
It was before.
So Nemesis was like 2002, I think, or 2003, and then Enterprise, which was, in my opinion, the worst of all the shows.
I disagree as well.
I know, and that's what's going to be interesting. We're going to get into that. But after that show kind of like fizzled out and failed in the around 2005, I guess that show ended. It was like really kind of like, what now is with Star Trek? Finally, for the first time in almost 20 years, like 18 years, there's no Star Trek on TV anymore, and it doesn't look good that there's going to be a movie anytime soon. And then like within 4 years they made the new Star Trek, and I said, that's good. That's kind of probably what you need right now, is something to kind of like bring it back, make it exciting, make it accessible, get the core message across about what the show is about and what it is we're trying to convey with this show, which I think was always like exploration, making you kind of improving upon yourself. A lot of the things that have to deal with the Prime Directive and the Federation, I think, were a lot of the core message. And then with the new one, same thing. Like, they're keeping the momentum going, which is exciting. As far as the new cast goes, I don't think that overall they are as good as the original. I don't think they have necessarily the same chemistry. And I think a lot of things that makes it, of all the Star Trek crews that have sort of come and gone, you have to have chemistry among your group. Like,
well, the chemistry with the originals was that wasn't created. That was just there. Now, these guys that they've picked for this one were picked based off of their similarity to the original characters. the chemistry is never going to be the same.
No, and nor should it be. It should be. You are taking the same characters and trying to replicate what they had, but make it different. So, like Kirk and Bones are going to have to relate to each other in a particular way.
Yeah.
I think the biggest. Sorry, good.
But I think one of the major problems with Star Trek, the new franchise movies, is they're kind of relying on the old familiarity of the characters. So you're kind of looking for that relationship between Kirk and Bones and Kirk and Spock, and your expectations already are there to kind of pad the fact that it isn't as tight as the original crew. The original crew had 3 seasons of television and how many movies to develop this type of chemistry. 2 movies in, you're not really expecting it, to be as tight, and I don't think people should be. Yeah.
No. It's silly to think so, and that's what made this new crew different. Even though it's supposed to be Kirk, Spock, and Bones, and all the rest of them. They're different versions of these characters, and they're intentionally playing them differently. And they're not going to have it took a long time for the original series to get there. The whole dynamic between Spock and Bones that exists in the original series, that wasn't there right away. That was something that the writers started putting in the show slowly over the course of years, and then it's sort of entrenched in our minds as Spock and Bones always at odds, and Kirk's sort of always trying to balance the 2 opinions. But in terms of overall chemistry, they had it. And that's why a lot of times the early seasons of the television series are a little bit weaker, just because they don't really have it yet. The writers haven't figured it out quite yet, how to work with this particular crew. The actors haven't gotten used to playing their parts yet. They haven't fully developed into it. And so with these guys, considering all the obstacles that go into that, they did a pretty good job. If I have to look at each one of those characters separately, I think Kirk. Chris Pine as Kirk. It was a really good choice. I think Quinto as Spock. I'm on the fence about him. I find a little bit of his portrayal a bit strange. Carl Urban as Bones, probably the most interesting one of all of them, because he's Bones was always the older kind of weathered Southern doctor guy.
Yeah.
And in these movies, Bones is a freaking gladiator. He's got muscles, and he's big, and he's young, and he's good looking, and he's not quite the salty old doctor that you would expect him to be.
Yeah, when I think of Bones, I think of a old curmudgeon who was kind of beaten down, and they try to make reference to that in the movies, talking about his wife, how she took everything in the divorce, but you don't really see that. You don't really see him as you could see him in a club, just getting some ladies. He looks that type of yes. It looks like that type of dude.
Yeah. A couple of quick facts for you guys. You were close, Dave. Q was in 8 episodes, not 10.
Oh, okay.
Domestic gross for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Now, keep in mind different eras. 82.3 million. All right.
In 79 or whatever that was.
Yes, 1979. And then you have the new Star Trek movie, which also has worldwide figures. But domestic was 257.7 with an opening weekend of 75 million.
Yep. But Into Darkness had a lower domestic opening and a lower domestic box office, but had a greater worldwide box office than Star Trek 2009.
Yeah, domestic for Into Darkness was 227.2.
Yep.
And their opening weekend was 70.1 million, which is 5 million less than its predecessor.
Yep. But what Paramount would be looking at is the fact that it did much better overseas, and therefore they're like, this is a money cow.
Yeah. there's really like how much the U.S. Factors into it, U.S. and Canada.
Well, worldwide for Into Darkness was $453.7 million.
That's pretty good, right? That's got to be the best ever they've ever done.
Let me see what Star Trek did worldwide. Yeah, Star Trek worldwide did $385.7 million.
Huh.
So it did better.
Well, but like as we all know, dollars don't really equate which movie's better.
No, money-wise, it did better.
I think we can think of plenty of examples of that. Like in terms of like Nemesis did okay, I think, at the box office, didn't it?
Look it up real quick.
Like in terms of what they spent and then what they made on the movie, but it killed the franchise because it was like the last. Oh.
Okay, looking at my figures here that I have, Nemesis production budget was $60 million. Opening weekend was $18 million, which was $4 million less than what Insurrection made. Its domestic box office will end up being $43 million, which is about 27 million less than what Insurrection made. And its final worldwide box office was 67 million, which is about 50 million less than what Insurrection made. That is a huge drop.
Oh, okay, so it was that is part of the reason they killed it. Okay, first of all, that movie kills Data. That movie sort of breaks up the crew, right?
But
Riker goes off to be his own captain, but really killing Data was probably the biggest thing that killed the whole Next Generation. Like, and it was such an anticlimactic way to go out.
Well,
for that crew.
I don't even think it was the fact that Insurrection wasn't good. It was because Insurrection was so awful and people felt burned by it that they weren't going to come back. That's what I meant by it. Like, Insurrection, I think, just told people, yep, you might as well just watch a series and save your money on television because you're going to get another, like a procedural. You're going to get another episode of The Wacky Crew on another adventure where they wrap everything up in about, instead of 42 minutes, it's going to be an hour and a half.
Yeah, so what's the difference, right?
Yeah.
And other than that, the production value is better. But I think for the most Star Trek fans, it's nice to have the good effects. It's nice to have all those that glitter, but really the story has to be good at the end of the day.
Which is why I kind of envy Doctor Who fans, because for the most part, Doctor Who doesn't look like Battlestar Galactica in terms of its production values, right? But the fan base is accepting of it, right? And it's able to focus on story and the characters, and that's why they love the show. It's a science fiction show where the focus is on the characters and the plotting, not the special effects. And they have enough fans that they can support that show, and the show does well. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, Star Trek cannot have it that way right now.
Can't have it both ways?
Well, it can't have it right now. Like, right now, the focus is Star Trek is a science fiction juggernaut and should be making us a ton of money. Doctor Who doesn't make... I don't know. I'm not a Whovian fan to know how much it makes, but to my understanding, it doesn't make as much, or can. How should I say it? Doctor Who has a cultural, base in the UK, and then it seems that everything else is gravy, whereas Paramount is looking at Star Trek as being this worldwide phenomenon that they could make money hand over fist with, and the only way to do that really is to make these big budget movies that appeal to, once again, worldwide community.
Yeah, but say at Doctor Who, they stop making Doctor Who next year, it's its final season. They make a movie out of it 5 years from now, you better believe they're going to whore that thing out.
You gotta believe it, right? And I think for a lot of the Who fans, they would reject it, right? They would feel burned by it.
But who would be in charge of it? I don't think like a big studio like Paramount would be. I don't think it was it BBC that has the rights to Doctor Who, or whoever has the rights to it isn't gonna just generally sell it out like that. Whereas Paramount has always had Star Trek in their grasp.
Yeah, but Paramount used to care about making a good Star Trek movie. It seemed like, or they didn't overinvest in the franchise. But yeah, I understand that it's Star Trek and they want to make money off of it. And I think that those movies walk the line fine enough. And to be honest with you, I don't even think, for the most part, Star Trek serves well in film because of the nature of everything having to kind of wrap up in 2 hours. So unless it's a really good story, which I don't think they, like First Contact's an example. I'd say Wrath of Khan, probably Star Trek 4 and Star Trek 6 would be up among my top films.
I can agree with that.
Yeah, because those ones are where there's a little bit more to it, and each one is for a different reason. Star Trek 2, it's about like that whole getting old thing and being and what does that mean in my life and everything else. Star Trek 4 is really just like a fun fighting against the universe and the conditions of nature that are kind of presented against you, and they're coming off Spock coming back to life and all that kind of stuff. So it was just kind of a lighthearted version of it. And then Star Trek 6 was a real like analogy to the whole the Chernobyl incident, the ending of the Iron Curtain with the Cold War, and that was kind of personified with the Klingons, right? They said that they made Star Trek 6 on the premise of like only Nixon could go to China with that old paradigm, right? So the same thing with Kirk. Only Kirk could be the one to go negotiate with the Klingons for peace, and that's why that film is maybe the best Star Trek movie ever. And then you get into and First Contact, different reasons. First Contact was really about how do you connect what people are like today with what the people are like in Star Trek, and where's that in between stage there? And that's what Enterprise was supposed to be as well. But Enterprise fell flat for me at least, mostly because I just didn't really feel like the characters had that chemistry that we keep talking about. Next, like of all the series, I think they had it the least. Including this new crew with Chris Pine and Quinto and whoever. I always just I didn't care about Scott Bakula or Jolene Blaylock or the T'Pol characters. I couldn't get into any of those characters. The guy who drives the ship, that Mayweather guy.
Mayweather.
He's a friggin' stiff. He just he doesn't have any expression. He's like whatever, Captain. Take the ship out, Mr. Mayweather. Boop, boop, boop. He just bores me to death, that guy. I kind of like the Malcolm Reed character on that show, like the British weapons officer, security chief.
Yeah.
Beyond that, and Phlox is watchable, like the Doctor.
Watchable, just watchable.
He's watchable. He's pretty decent, I guess.
Scott Bakula should have never been casted as the captain in that anyway. That was a bad casting decision. Not that I loved Scott Bakula, like I told you guys before. Quantum Leap was one of my favorite series ever, but he was just a bad choice.
I think he was a great choice. I just think that they just couldn't really handle exactly how he would best fit the character. Because when I think of Star Trek captains, I think of an era of sophistication, of this kind of roguish charm for Kirk, for the most part. And when I'm thinking, okay, this is early Starfleet. They're supposed to be extremely rough around the edges. Bakula just has this type of everyman type of attitude and just general feeling that I could just see him as I can see myself as him or like him. I kind of relate to him on that level. Picard looks like he feels like a captain, like he was polished, right? And Cisco is Cisco for the most part.
Cisco is Cisco, yeah.
Yeah,
so that's why I really like the casting decision of Bakula's Archer. I don't think it went too well, but I still like him a lot more than Janeway, though.
But even the guys you mentioned, Kirk, Picard, and Cisco, there's one thing all those guys had that Bakula didn't bring into it, and that's the swagger.
Yeah, well, I don't think that Patrick Stewart has any swagger whatsoever.
Vash would disagree.
You think he comes across to me as a great statesman, like a diplomat, a very reserved guy. He's not too much into being too macho or being too bold in most cases.
I don't mean swagger as in being macho. I'm saying swagger as in any of those guys walk in the room, they've got their presence, they've got the way they hold themselves, and they command everybody's attention there.
You're talking about charisma.
Yeah, the charisma swagger of the character.
Right.
But isn't that something that was like brought up repeatedly in Enterprise, that Archer really wasn't a diplomat, really wasn't that type of captain that Starfleet was looking for, and he kind of had to progress to that level. He didn't really on the show, but that was the story that I felt that was needed to be told. How do you take someone who's just basically this military guy for the most part, right? Who dreams of, piloting this ship to explore, but now he has to be a representative for Starfleet and Earth, and he's just thrown into that position and doesn't really have the skill set to mend fences.
Well, he doesn't have the experience, right? He's never been in those situations. And it's a naivety with that crew, and I think that their intentions were good. The writers meant well on what they were trying to do. But Bakula, for me, I love myself some Quantum Leap as much as everybody, but to me, he's not a Star Trek captain. He doesn't have that same charisma. I like watching Scott Bakula in interviews. I think he's a good guy, but his version of a captain, I would expect him to be sort of not like Kirk, but almost like a step behind Kirk. Because Kirk is 100 years after that Archer character. And by the time it's Kirk's like, I'm going to fucking kill the Klingons. I'm going to blow up some Romulans. I'm going to
punch someone in the face. That type of
I'm going to punch people. That's me, right? And Bakula's not like that at all. Bakula's...
No, not at all.
Even when he tried... Huh?
No, he's not at all. Bakula.
No, he's kind of a wimp. He's kind of this wimpy captain trying to be tough to me. He doesn't have the credibility as far as I'm concerned, and in terms of the rest of the characters, they just didn't really have it for me.
You didn't like Travis at all?
No, Travis is the worst one of them all.
Really?
Yeah, he's at the bottom for me. Just because that character never really does anything in the show, it seems like, and he just kind of sits there like a robot most of the time, staring at the view screen. Where do I go next? He never really.
Well, I did feel that with Travis they were trying to emulate Tom Paris from Voyager a lot, and it wasn't the same.
Yeah, but that actor Anthony Montgomery, he doesn't have the same charisma to me as Robert Duncan McNeil, who played Tom Paris, or that same rebellious sense. And we can talk about Voyager too. And we're probably gonna have more episodes where we're gonna get into each show. More in depth, but in terms of Voyager and what that show meant, to me it's not as good as Deep Space Nine or Next Generation, or maybe it's kind of a clone of Next Generation in a lot of sense. It's the same procedural show, as you would say it, where a lot even though they're
overarching theme that they need
overarching theme, the main difference is they're trapped on the other side of the galaxy, so they're trying to get home. Okay, that's fine. But for the most part, along the way, they're stopping into meet the new aliens or threat of the week or something. For them, they have a few more episodes where we might get home this week. Oh no, it's kind of like the Gilligan's Island effect.
Yeah.
Where this is the episode they're gonna get off the island, but they never do. Janeway is a captain.
I'm not a big fan of her as a captain.
What was that show where was it Jumper? It wasn't Jumpers. Where they were always trying to get home every episode.
That was Sliders.
Sliders. That show was awesome.
Up until second and third season, but yeah,
that was a good show. But sorry, that's off topic.
I like me some Sliders too, Jim. Don't worry. And. Yeah, Voyager. Okay, so they kind of combined the Maquis thing in there initially. Are you familiar with that, Jim?
A little bit.
they were like a group of Starfleet Federation rebels, essentially, who, which I thought was an interesting spin, like where the Federation signs a treaty with a race called the Cardassians, and a lot of these colonists who sort of live along the border now have to live in Cardassian space, and it becomes a huge issue, and they become a bunch of terrorists and freedom fighters, or whatever you want to call them. And what happens is on Voyager, they get kind of combined with the Starfleet crew because they get thrown to the other side of the galaxy. But essentially, that all goes away after maybe the first season, I'd say.
They make reference to it like a couple of times later on, but for the most part, all the tension that was there, they kind of just combine, join forces completely and become one crew after the first season.
Did that Cardassian race all have big asses, though?
Okay.
Some did. Some.
They have their own reality show now, don't they?
Yeah, Keeping Up with the Cardassians.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. We do have to end this episode at some point, but don't worry, there will be more of Live Long and Podcast. I figured we could go through a top 10 list, and for me, I'm going to hit you with one of my top 10 lists, and you can react as we go through. What do you want? Next Generation, original series?
I say TNG because everyone is familiar with it.
Yeah,
Everyone's
TNG.
familiar? All right, my top 10 TNG episodes. All right. At number 10, Q-Who, which is the episode where Q flings the Enterprise into, sort of near the Delta Quadrant, and they meet the Borg for the first time. It's the first introduction of the Borg in the show.
Good episode. Great episode.
Yeah. My number 9 episode from season 7, Parallels, which is the episode with the Worf, with Security Chief Worf. He's shifting between realities. The premise of the episode being that in life, every time you make a decision, whether you turn left or right or whatever, you may eat something different, every decision and every possibility that could happen does happen in another quantum reality. So essentially, he's kind of like shifting through the multiverse of Star Trek, where in one reality he's married to Deanna Troi, in one reality he's the first officer of the ship. And I always liked that one because it kind of showed the different possibilities of what there could be in life and how small decisions really affect outcomes.
Yeah.
My number 8 episode from season 4, it's called Brothers. The episode is called Brothers. This is the introduction the on-screen introduction of Noonien Soong, who's the creator of Data, and Lore, his evil android brother, where Brent Spiner plays Data, Noonien Soong, and Lore all in the same episode. Especially poignant for me because, I got brothers too, so I definitely understand the connection there. And in that episode, there's also a couple of kids on the Enterprise that sort of parallel the relationship with Lore and Data to an extent. One brother causes the other brother to get infected by this poisonous plant, and they need to get him back to the starbase, and the one brother won't talk to the other brother, and they come together and forgive each other because that's what brothers do. So I always kind of found that episode a little bit special. That's my number 8 episode. At number 7, The Chain of Command from season 6. This is the 2-parter where Picard resigns as the captain of the Enterprise unexpectedly, and a new captain comes in, Captain Jellicoe. Picard goes on a secret mission to Cardassian space to sort of find out a secret. They find out it's a trap, and Captain Picard gets tortured by some Cardassians for the better part of the second episode in that 2-parter.
How many lights are there?
There are 4 lights. No, there are 5 lights. Number 6 from season 4, The Drumhead. This is where the witch hunt ensues for suspected Romulan spies, and it was a really good example of how sometimes, even in the most ideal society, in this case Star Trek and the Federation, how personal liberties and people who have not done anything wrong get persecuted because of fear and paranoia. It was kind of like a parallel to the McCarthy era in communism, where everybody sees spies everywhere, and Picard stands up and says, this is wrong. This has happened in different parts of our history, and I'm not going to stand for it. And he has to go toe to toe with this big admiral. And by the way, that happens to be Michael Dorn's favorite episode. Number 5, The Offspring from season 3, which is one where Data creates his daughter Lau.
I love it when they throw the ball at her and she reacts very slowly.
Or it hits her in the head. They're practicing. She's an android that can lift, 10 tons, but she can't catch a ball in time. That one always brings a tear to my eye because, at the end, spoilers, she dies. And Data, being without emotions, can't really grieve for her. Number 4 from season 7, The Pegasus.
Great episode.
Guest starring, what's his name again? He's from Lost.
Colin Quinn? Is it?
No, Terry Quinn. Terry Quinn, who played John Locke on Lost. Where he's like I always loved that episode in particular because of the conflict with Riker. And another reason Enterprise sucks, because Enterprise has a crossover with this episode in a way, where the finale of Star Trek Enterprise features Riker during the events of this episode. But he's on the holodeck interacting with holographic versions of Archer and his crew. And if you edited those 2 episodes together, there would be a huge disconnect, because when he's on the holodeck, he's all happy, but when he's on the Pegasus, in the episode of the Pegasus in TNG, he's extremely torn. He can't tell this truth to his captain. He's overridden by guilt by this this accident that happened when he was a young officer. So I always loved that episode, and I thought it really showed off Riker and what it really premises the fact that the Federation isn't perfect either, because they start experimenting with illegal cloaking technology that they had banned after signing the Treaty of Algeron with the Romulans. All right, at number 3, The Best of Both Worlds.
Are you including both parts 1 and parts 2?
Usually with 2-parters, I kind of combine them.
Okay.
Really, I guess the finale of part 1 is probably one of the greatest climaxes, definitely in Star Trek and probably in all of television, really, because the way that season 3 ended with Picard showing up on screen as Locutus, as the Borg, and then Riker goes, "Mr. Worf, fire." That was balls. Number 2, The Measure of a Man, yes. Season 2, where Data's rights are encroached upon, that he's not a sentient being, that he's technically property of Starfleet, and he has to literally fight for his life in court to not be dismantled and studied. And it really established the theme of what sentient rights are. How can you think of an android in the sense of the same way you would of a human being or any other living sentient being, and really how talking about, I think that in particular the scene with Guinan, played by Whoopi Goldberg, where she makes allusion to that throughout history there's always been disposable creatures that can do the jobs that are harder and more difficult than anybody else wants to do. And Picard quickly realizes that this is talking about slavery, and that sort of gives him his second wind to go back and fight for rights. And I think that those are the types of stories that Star Trek always told that I thought were especially poignant and made you kind of think differently about a whole bunch of things that you may have thought were true.
That scene with Riker, when he's Riker is positioned as as the prosecutor, or I guess the prosecutor in that respect, and he even though he has this relationship with Data, the understanding is he's going to do his best so that justice is done, and he hopes that Data is going to win, but he still has to do the best that he can. And when he does his argument and states that he's going to turn Data off, and literally turns Data off, that was just very powerful for me. Right? And you knew how much it hurt Riker to do it, but he had to.
Exactly. Yeah, the one who gives him the job of being the prosecutor is like, if I think you're not trying your hardest at any point, I'll rule in the favor of the prosecution, I guess. Yeah. So he has to really go at it, and that episode. Great character arc, and it was really good at establishing Data and a lot of the characters in that show, and what an android really meant. And at number 1, I don't know if this should come as too much of a surprise, but from season 7, the finale of the series, All Good Things. No, I was just going to say that I think when I watched that episode, I was like, that's got to be one of the greatest finales to any TV show ever. In this episode, it centers on Picard, which I think was the smart move to make it about the captain, and he's moving around he's jumping between 3 timelines, but he doesn't understand why. And eventually, the paradox of the story leads him to realize that the problems start in the future, and then there was an anti-time phenomenon. And it was a great combination of character, science. Q is kind of positioned as a villain, but also kind of positioned as a guide in the episode. And it really kind of tied the first episode of the series, being Encounter at Farpoint, with the end of the series.
Excellent bookends for a television show. Excellent bookends.
All right, so Jaemeel, reactions. What do you think of my top 10 list?
I was quite surprised by the lack of certain episodes, but like I'm not saying that your list is bad. Your list is perfectly fine, and I think that's one of the strengths of Star Trek: The Next Generation. You could look at it, and you don't have to make a top 10. You can make a top 20 or 30 of excellent episodes, and for the most part, you can say, you know what, you can pick any random 10, and for the most part, it's an acceptable top 10 list. There were that many great stories. Kind of surprised that there were a couple not included, but
okay, who do you think I left out?
I thought Darmok.
Oh, I love Darmok. Yeah, and I think it was probably in my top 15. Which is the episode with the guys who can't talk right, or who talk in metaphors.
Is that the one where they're like, he is smart, he will make us go?
No, you're talking about the Pack-Leds.
Yeah.
I love that episode.
Yeah.
Darmok specifically. Then I'm thinking
Shaka when the walls fell.
Yeah, Shaka when the walls fell. Who watches the Watchers? Where
where it's a real like prime directive story.
Very prime directive story. I always like that one as well.
Well, Who Watches the Watchers being really driving home that point of non-interference, and how interfering in other cultures and their natural development is a mistake, and the irreparable damage you can cause from that. In this case, Star Trek has always established the policy that they don't interact with alien worlds that haven't reached space travel, essentially interstellar space travel, and the standard being warp speed having been invented by that culture. Yes. And in this case, they're dealing with like sort of maybe a Bronze Age culture of peaceful people, but they come to realize that these Starfleet officers are observing them, and they come to worship them as gods, and how they had kind of outgrew superstition and a lot of their old practices were now being all brought back, and it was really kind of turning the tides on them and hurting their progression. And that's one of the things I've always believed about even global affairs to an extent, that when you're like countries really shouldn't be interfering with the natural development of other countries in the most case. Like it's really something that cultures have to work out on their own.
Next episode, I will compile my top 10 list. And
all right, man.
I just gave away 2 out of my top 10, because definitely those 2 would be in my top 10. So you're going to have to wait till the next episode to see the remaining 8.
All right.
Next Generation.
All right. And they'll be in order. Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap this episode up. This has been great, and I'm looking forward to the next one. Are we going to start doing this on a regular night?
Oh, yeah.
We should probably pick a night of the week and start doing it. And we're going to include Jim and other people who want to participate, and I can't wait to get the first episode up and live. Any other final thoughts?
I have a whole bunch of other questions that we're probably going to hit in the next episode, so I'm looking forward to it. Definitely.
Excellent. Yeah, me too, man. And we're gonna hit a lot of themes. We have so much Star Trek to talk about. We only scratched the surface tonight, barely at that. And I've had a lot of fun discussing this all with you because there's very few people that I have in my personal life that can go on about this at length. One is my brother Jeff, and I think Jaemeel, you're the other kindred spirit I've met who really knows the show on the same level. And Jim, we appreciate you joining us tonight.
I'm happy to be on the first episode. That's historic right there. But
right there, that's a landmark guest.
Just remember, though, if you guys got so much to talk about, you don't want to blow your nut on the first one.
Yes. Maybe that should be the name of the episode.
Blowing your nut?
Busting your nut. Busting your whole nut on what was it, First Contact in that case.
Are you going to be like our Q, or are you going to show up in like 8 episodes?
There we go. That'd be perfect.
Very fitting. All right. Well, with no further ado, this has been Live Long and Podcast, the greatest Star Trek podcast in the world. And I'm Dave Mater.
I'm Jaemeel Robinson.
Jim Edelson.
Stay classy.
We come in peace, shoot to kill, shoot to kill, shoot to kill. We come in peace, shoot to kill, man.
It's worse than that, he's dead, Jim. Dead, Jim. Dead, Jim. It's worse than that, he's dead, Jim. Dead, Jim. Dead.
Well, it's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it, not as we know it. It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it, Captain.
There's Klingons on the starboard bow, starboard bow, starboard bow. There's Klingons on the starboard bow. Scrape them off, Jim.
Star trekking across the universe.
On the Starship Enterprise under Captain Kirk.
Star trekking across the universe.
Slowly going forward and things are getting worse. It's just that.
You cannot change the laws of physics. Laws of physics. Laws of physics. You cannot change the laws of physics. Laws of physics, Jim. Oh, we come in peace. Shoot to kill, shoot to kill, shoot to kill. We come in peace. Shoot to kill. Scotty, beat me up.
It's worse than that, he's dead, Jim. Dead, Jim. Dead, Jim. It's worse than that, he's dead, Jim. Dead, Jim. Dead.
Well, it's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it, not as we know it. It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it, Captain.
There's Klingons on the starboard bow, starboard bow, starboard bow. There's Klingons on the starboard bow, starboard bow.
You cannot change the script, Jim. Up to you, Jimmy.
It's worse than that, it's physics, Jim.
Bridge to engine room, warp factor 9.
If I give it any more, she'll blow